The sewing machine hummed like a trapped wasp in the quiet kitchen. Rain lashed against the dark window panes of the small Atlanta home, washing over the grime of a long night. Sarah Miller didn't look up from the heavy denim fabric under her needle. She knew the sound of Mark's footsteps on the porch. She knew his hesitation at the door, and the cold click of his key turning in the lock. He didn't say hello. He stood in the doorway, smelling of expensive bourbon, rain, and a floral perfume Sarah had never owned. "Stop the machine, Sarah," Mark said. His voice was flat, like a judge reading a final sentence. Sarah's foot stayed on the pedal for 3 seconds. Stitch, stitch, stitch. The needle punched through the thick hem of a work shirt, leaving a line of tight white thread. She lifted her foot. The sudden silence was louder than the motor. "It's over," Mark said, stepping into the dim overhead light. He looked immaculate in his tailored charcoal suit, a suit Sarah had hand-altered 2 weeks prior for his promotion meeting. "I've packed my things. The lawyers will reach out on Monday." Sarah looked at his polished shoes, clean despite the downpour, and then at his eyes. There was no anger. Worse, there was no guilt, just an icy, clinical distance. 12 years, Mark," Sarah said softly. Her throat felt dry, coated in cotton dust. "Don't play the martyr," Mark snapped, waving a hand dismissively. "You're comfortable in this kitchen, Sarah. You smell like thread grease and cheap coffee. Look at you. You've turned yourself into a ghost in your own home." He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a white envelope, and slapped it onto the wooden table next to her fabric. The sharp thack echoed against the walls. "There's $5,000 in there," Mark said with condescension. "Take it. Keep the machine. But you need to be out of my life. You can pump that pedal for 20 years, Sarah, but you'll never step out of this kitchen. You simply don't belong in my world anymore." He turned and walked out, shutting the heavy front door behind him. The deadbolt clicked. Outside, an engine turned over, tires splashed through standing water. And then there was only the rain. Sarah sat motionless under the harsh desk lamp. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She slowly rested her palms flat on the cold wooden table. Her hands were rough, lined with tiny calluses from millions of pinpricks and heavy shears. She looked at the white envelope. $5,000. The price Mark had put on 12 years of her life. To understand how Sarah Miller found herself standing in the ruins of her marriage on that rain-soaked night, one has to go back 12 years, to the day she gave up her own dreams to build a man who would eventually decide she wasn't worth looking at. 12 years ago, Mark Thorne had nothing but a cheap briefcase and mountain of ambition. He was trying to break into the ruthless Atlanta real estate market. Sarah was 26, working 2 jobs, with hands that could transform raw fabric into art. When Mark couldn't afford a car for client meetings, Sarah sold her late mother's sedan. She took the bus carrying heavy fabric shears in a canvas bag, so Mark could drive a reliable car. When Mark needed to look successful, Sarah stayed up until 3 in the morning deconstructing thrift store suits, resizing shoulders, narrowing lapels, and stitching them back together until Mark looked like an executive. "We're a team, Sarah," Mark used to say back then, pulling her into his lap while dark roast coffee filled their tiny apartment. "Once I make it, I'll buy you the best equipment in Georgia. Just hang in there with me." Sarah believed him. She poured her youth into his shadow. When Mark opened his first small brokerage, Sarah became his unpaid office manager, seamstress, and cook. She ironed his shirts until creases were razor sharp, making sure he never stepped out looking like anything less than a success. But success in the corporate world became a slow poison. As Mark's income grew, his appreciation shrank. The first shift was subtle. A scoff when she wore her apron to dinner. A wince when wealthy friends asked what Sarah did, and Mark would quickly answer, "Oh, Sarah manages local textiles. hiding her sewing work. Then came the cold silence, the slow violence of emotional withdrawal. Mark stopped asking about her day. He stopped looking her in the eyes. When he spoke, his words were short and heavy with criticism. "Must you leave sewing needles on the counter? That lotion smells like a craft store. I'm eating with clients tonight. Don't wait up." Sarah tried harder. She bought new dresses Mark didn't notice. She cooked elaborate meals that grew cold on the stove. She shrank herself, trying to become invisible, thinking if she created no friction, his warmth would return. It never did. Instead, Jessica Vance entered the picture. Jessica was 26, dressed in designer labels funded by her family's trust, working as a marketing consultant for Mark's firm. She didn't smell of cotton dust or machine oil. She smelled of expensive vanilla jasmine perfume and status. She laughed loudly at Mark's jokes. At mixers, Sarah was no longer invited to attend. The rumors reached Sarah through a neighbor who saw Mark's car parked outside a boutique hotel in Midtown. When Sarah confronted him, Mark didn't deny it. He looked at her with disgust, as if she were a nuisance. Now, sitting alone in the dark kitchen at 3 a.m., Sarah stared at her reflection in the dark window glass. She saw a woman with faint lines around her eyes, hair in an unpretentious bun, wearing a gray sweatshirt stained with tailor's chalk. She looked tired. She looked beaten. Slowly, Sarah reached out and picked up her heavy steel shears. The cold metal felt heavy and solid in her hand. She squeezed the handles together. Snip! The sharp blades sliced through the air with a clean, lethal whisper. Sarah didn't cry a single tear that night. The quiet kitchen was no longer a cage. It was a canvas. Mark hadn't destroyed her. He had simply stripped away everything that wasn't her. She picked up a fresh notepad and wrote a single line at the top. "Miller Safety and Apparel, Day 1. Her foot pressed the pedal again. But this time, she wasn't sewing a suit for Mark. She was stitching her own way out. 5 years passed in a quiet, relentless hum. The morning air in Piedmont Park smelled of damp pine needles and crisp autumn mist. Every day at 5:30 a.m., before the sun crested the Atlanta skyline, Sarah Miller ran under the arching oak trees. Her running shoes hit the pavement with a steady, rhythmic thud-thud-thud. Her lungs burned, but with every sharp exhale, she felt the ghost of her past life leaving her body. 5 years ago, Sarah had made a choice. She stopped weeping over the ashes of her marriage and took full responsibility for her future. She cut her hair into a clean, sleek bob that framed her sharp jawline. She discarded the oversized gray sweatshirts stained with chalk. In their place, she wore tailored blazers and structured dresses that moved with purpose. She looked into the mirror each morning and no longer saw a victim. She saw a businesswoman. Her transformation was not just cosmetic, it was built on grueling action. Sarah enrolled in night classes at the Georgia Institute of Technology, studying textile engineering and business management. While other students went home to sleep, Sarah sat under the harsh fluorescent lights of the campus library. Her eyes burned as she analyzed supply chains, fire-retardant fabric specs, and federal safety regulations. She realized early on that reopening a small tailoring shop was a trap. Local alteration work was a race to the bottom. Instead, Sarah identified a massive, underserved gap in the Georgia market. Heavy-duty, high-visibility safety workwear specifically tailored for industrial construction crews. She leased a small warehouse in an industrial pocket of West Midtown. The air inside smelled of fresh cotton, vulcanized rubber, and machine oil. Sarah bought 3 reconditioned industrial sewing machines. She hired 2 experienced seamstresses who had been laid off from a local factory. She didn't just design the gear. She tested it herself. She pulled heavy steel shears through a triple-stitched canvas. She tested flame-resistant coatings under intense heat, recording every result on her clipboard. Her breakthrough came during her third year of operation. The city was expanding its urban transit network, requiring hundreds of certified safety vests and flame-retardant coveralls. David Vance, the lead contractor and owner of Vance Infrastructure, stepped into Sarah's warehouse on a scorching Tuesday afternoon. The air was thick with the scent of a hot iron press and motor oil. David was a broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s with silver-streaked hair, sun-bronzed skin, and clear, perceptive blue eyes. He didn't wear a designer suit to impress people. He wore a crisp work shirt with rolled-up sleeves and steel-toed boots dusted with dried Georgia red clay. David picked up one of Sarah's prototype high-visibility jackets, hanging on the rack. He ran his thick, callous thumb over the reinforced double seams. He pulled on the zipper with a heavy tug. It didn't snag. He turned to Sarah, genuinely impressed. "Most suppliers give us cheap polyester that tears on the first piece of rebar," David said. His voice was deep, resonant, and calm. "This stitch work is bulletproof." "I don't make disposable gear, Mr. Vance," Sarah replied, standing straight, her hands resting comfortably in her blazer pockets. "My gear keeps your workers alive and comfortable through 12-hour shifts." David looked at her, not with condescension, but with deep respect. He saw a woman who knew her craft inside and out. He placed an initial order for 500 units on the spot. That single order launched Miller Safety and Apparel into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. Over the next 2 years, Sarah expanded her facility to 30 heavy machinery stations and 40 full-time employees. Her revenue hit 8 figures. Yet, Sarah never forgot where she came from. She managed her finances with absolute discipline. She paid her workers above-market wages and set aside a significant portion of her corporate profits for a private philanthropic venture. She established the Evelyn Scholarship Fund, named after her late mother, administered independently by a premier Atlanta trust bank. The fund provided full-ride grants for young women pursuing degrees in industrial engineering and design. Sarah insisted on complete anonymity. The selection committee operated without knowing her personal identity, ensuring that recipients earned their awards strictly through merit. Her personal life transformed alongside her career. David Vance did not chase her with grand, theatrical gestures or hollow promises. He showed up consistently. He brought her hot, dark roast coffee on rainy mornings at the warehouse. He listened intently when she talked about her expansion plans. 2 years after their first meeting, they married in a quiet, intimate ceremony at a historic chapel in Savannah, surrounded only by a handful of close friends and Sarah's daughter, Chloe. David never asked Sarah to dim her light. He stood beside her as an equal, admiring her strength and honoring her independence. Chloe was 17 now, a brilliant high school senior with her mother's sharp focus and an innate passion for structural engineering. Sarah raised Chloe to be fiercely independent, teaching her the value of hard work without burdening her with family drama or material excess. Sitting in her glass-walled corner office overlooking the Midtown skyline, Sarah signed the final quarterly financial statement for Miller Safety and Apparel. The sun poured through the window, warming her hands. She picked up her pen, set it down, and took a slow, deep breath. The scent of fresh leather and cotton drifted from the production floor below. The steady, muffled cadence of 50 industrial sewing machines echoed through the building, a powerful, harmonious symphony of productivity. Sarah smiled softly, looking at a framed photo on her desk of David and Chloe laughing at a summer barbecue. The wounds of the past were fully healed, replaced by unbreakable strength. She closed her leather ledger, stood up, and walked toward the elevator. Tonight was the 20th anniversary gala of the Georgia Young Entrepreneurs Association at the Regency Hotel. She was ready. The grand foyer of the Regency Hotel hummed with prosperity. High crystal chandeliers cast a warm radiance across polished marble floors. A live jazz quartet played soft brass notes near the bar, their melody blending with clinking champagne flutes and polite chatter. The air smelled of expensive floral perfume, roasted coffee beans, and aged whiskey. Mark Thorne adjusted his silk tie in a mirrored pillar. At 40, his hair was thinning at the temples, but his charcoal tuxedo was impeccably pressed. Beside him stood Jessica Vance. At 32, Jessica looked every bit the image of modern luxury. She wore a backless crimson dress that shimmered under the lights, her wrist heavy with diamond bangles. Her gold-painted eyes scanned the room for influential faces. "Mark, make sure Julian sits at our table," Jessica whispered eagerly. "He said he's bringing his equity partners tonight. If we lock in this real estate deal, we can finally buy that estate in Buckhead." "Relax, Jess," Mark said, puffing out his chest. "Julian is family now. He knows I'm the best sales director here." Julian Reed stepped toward them from the valet lounge. At 42, Julian projected the aura of immense wealth. He wore a tailored Italian suit that hugged his frame with precision. His slick-back hair and fast, practiced smile exuded confidence. He held a glass of vintage scotch, his left hand resting casually in his pocket. "Mark, my man," Julian called out, clapping Mark on the shoulder. "The Atlanta elite are out tonight. Big money in the room." "Always a pleasure, Julian." Mark laughed, shaking his hand. "Did you double-check the wire details for the commercial parcel?" Jessica asked, leaning close, smelling of sweet vanilla jasmine perfume. "It's all lined up. Beautiful." Julian winked, his eyes flickering with a cold, calculating spark. "Once the infrastructure grant clears next week, our yields will blow off the charts." At that moment, the brass doors of the entrance opened. A subtle shift rippled through the foyer. Conversations dipped by half a register. The crowd naturally parted for an arriving couple. Mark turned, expecting a politician or an athlete. His jaw went slack. Sarah Miller walked into the ballroom. She wore a floor-length emerald silk gown that draped over her posture with grace. Her dark hair was styled in a sleek bob that highlighted her sharp jawline. She wore simple pearl earrings, yet she commanded the room without effort. Beside her walked David Vance. David wore a classic black tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders comfortably. He didn't look like a man trying to impress anyone. He looked like a man who owned the ground he walked on. On his left wrist sat a plain steel watch, its face showing faint scratches from years of daily wear. "Is that—" Jessica squinted in disbelief. "Is that your ex-wife, Mark?" Mark couldn't answer. His throat felt dry. He hadn't seen Sarah in 5 years. The woman standing across the marble floor was not the exhausted seamstress who smelled of thread grease. She was radiant. She moved with an unshakable poise. David slid his hand comfortably into Sarah's. She smiled up at him, an authentic, warm smile Mark had not seen in a decade. "What is she doing here?" Mark muttered, a cold not forming in his stomach. Mark grabbed a glass of champagne from a waiter's tray and stepped directly into Sarah and David's path. Jessica and Julian followed, right behind him. "Sarah," Mark said, his voice laced with forced warmth. Well, I barely recognized you." Sarah stopped. Her eyes met Mark's. There was no flinching. There was no anger. Her gaze was as clear and calm as still water. "Hello, Mark," Sarah said softly. "I'm surprised to see you at the Regency Gala," Mark said, throwing a dismissive look at her dress. "Traded your sewing apron for a nice gown? Are you doing alteration work for the attendees tonight?" Jessica snickered behind her glass. "Mark told me all about your little craft work, Sarah. It's sweet that you still get out to these events." Sarah didn't react. She stood tall, resting her hand naturally on David's arm. Julian stepped forward, looking down his nose at David. He looked at David's polished shoes, then his plain suit, and finally locked onto David's scratched steel watch. Julian smirked. "I don't think we've been introduced," Julian said, extending a hand clad in a gold signet ring. "Julian Reed, private equity, infrastructure development, real estate." "David Vance," David replied, taking Julian's hand with a firm, steady grip. "Contractor." Julian's smirk broadened. He raised his wrist, angling his gold Rolex so the light caught the diamonds along the bezel. "A contractor," Julian repeated, his voice carrying across 3 surrounding tables. "Rough work. I suppose a plain steel watch makes sense for someone working in the dirt. My timepieces are precision investments. You have to know the value of what you wear, wouldn't you say?" Mark grinned, waiting for David to fumble. David didn't blush. He didn't look down. He looked straight into Julian's eyes with a calm, penetrating stare that made Julian's smile freeze. David raised his left hand slightly, tapping the scratched steel watch face with his thumb. "This belonged to my father," David said, his voice deep, clear, and steady. "He wore it for 30 years while pouring concrete for the city's water lines. It doesn't have diamonds, Mr. Reed, but it measures sweat, honesty, and hard work. As a man gets older, he realizes a watch's value isn't measured by what you pay for it. It's measured by the character of the man wearing it." The surrounding guests fell quiet. 2 nearby real estate executives nodded in silent approval. Julian's face flushed red. He opened his mouth to reply, but no words came out. Mark stood frozen, looking from David's steady eyes to Sarah's serene face. The air in the foyer suddenly felt stifling, heavy with an impending storm. The double oak doors of the grand ballroom swung open, revealing a cavern of warm gold and silver light. Hundreds of crystal prisms hung from towering ceilings, scattering sparkles across silk tablecloths, ice sculptures, and polished silver cutlery. The heavy air smelled of seared tenderloin, truffle butter, popping champagne corks, and rich floral arrangements of white lilies and dark roses. Mark Thorne cleared his throat, pushing past the awkward tension in the foyer. He straightened his cufflinks, determined to reassert his dominance. Beside him, Jessica clicked her high heels against the parquet floor, her gold-draped wrists jingling like restless coins. Julian Reed followed, his cheeks still flushed red from David Vance's quiet words, though his mouth had twisted back into a tight, defensive sneer. "Let's get to the center table," Jessica demanded softly, her voice sharp with desperation. "I want to sit near the main stage. The local news crews are taking photos near the podium." Mark led the way toward the elevated VIP section in the center of the ballroom. A round table covered in heavy black velvet stood beneath the primary chandelier, surrounded by plush leather chairs. Silver place cards sat beside crystal glasses. Mark pulled out a chair for Jessica and gestured for Julian to sit. "Here we go. Prime view of the room." Before Julian could slide his suit coat off, a tall man in a tailored black tuxedo stepped into their path. It was Arthur Pendleton, the general manager of the Regency Hotel, carrying a silver clipboard. "Pardon me, sir," Mr. Pendleton said, his voice smooth, polite, and unyielding. "These seats are reserved." Mark frowned, puffing out his chest. "Look here, I am Mark Thorne, Senior Director at Apex Real Estate. This is Julian Reed of Reed Private Equity. We are leading figures in the Georgia development sector. We belong at the head table." Jessica stepped forward, her crimson dress rustling softly. "We are supposed to be upgraded to the central VIP cluster. My fiancé is investing millions into Midtown infrastructure." Mr. Pendleton looked down at his silver clipboard, then looked up at Mark with a calm, professional expression that carried no warmth. "I am well aware of who is in attendance tonight," sir," Mr. Pendleton replied, his voice carrying clearly over the soft piano music. However, the entire central VIP cluster, including this main table, the private lounge, and the premium champagne service for the evening, has been reserved exclusively. Mark sneered. "Reserved by whom? I know everyone on the committee." Mr. Pendleton gestured politely toward the entrance. The entire ballroom, along with the full evening sponsorship for the Georgia Young Entrepreneurs Gala, was underwritten in full by our diamond sponsor. He paused, ensuring his voice reached the surrounding tables. The entire evening was funded by Mrs. Sarah Miller, founder and chief executive officer of Miller Safety and Apparel. The words hung in the air like a sudden drop in temperature. Jessica's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The color drained from her face, leaving her gold eyeshadow looking stark and hollow against her pale skin. Mark felt a cold drop of sweat trickle down the back of his neck. His hands trembled slightly inside his pockets. "Sarah Miller." "Yes, sir," Mr. Pendleton added smoothly. "Mrs. Miller and her husband, Mr. Vance, are the primary hosts of tonight's gala. Their party will be occupying this table. If you'll follow me, I can direct you to the open seating area near the back exit." A quiet gasp rippled through the nearby tables. Several prominent Atlanta developers, who had been listening to the exchange, turned their heads. Whispers spread like wildfire across the white linen tables. "Did he say Sarah Miller?" "The woman who owns the safety gear contract for the new transit line. She built an 8-figure empire in 5 years." Mark stood frozen. The room seemed to tilt around him. He looked across the floor. Sarah walked toward the central table, accompanied by David Vance. Her emerald silk dress caught the chandelier light with every step. She didn't strut. She didn't glance around to see who was watching. She moved with the calm, steady grace of a woman who owned the ground beneath her feet. Julian's face darkened with humiliation. His chest heaved beneath his tailored Italian jacket. The arrogant smirk he had worn all evening collapsed into raw bitterness. He pulled out his gold Rolex once more, running a hand through his slicked hair, trying desperately to recapture control of the room. "So she signed a municipal contract." Julian sneered loudly, turning to face David as Sarah arrived at the table. "Money comes and goes in government work, but real class is bought. It's reflected in what you carry." Julian raised his left arm, shaking his wrist so the heavy gold Rolex clinked against his signet ring. The diamonds along the bezel flashed under the bright overhead lights. "Some of us build portfolios that buy luxury," Julian sneered, eyeing David's plain steel watch with open contempt. "Others just wear tools meant for labor." The surrounding guests went quiet. The air grew dense, heavy with expectation. David Vance stood beside Sarah. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't clench his fists. He looked at Julian's diamond watch, then met Julian's eyes with a calm, unreadable gaze. Slowly, David raised his left hand. He unclasped his plain steel watch, laying it flat on his open palm under the chandelier light. The metal was dull compared to Julian's gold, its face lined with tiny scratches from decades of hard work. "My father wore this watch for 30 years, David said. His deep voice resonated through the quiet circle of guests like a ringing bell. He wore it while digging trenches in the July heat. He wore it while pouring the foundation for the very bridge we drove over to get here tonight." David looked at Mark, then turned his gaze back to Julian. "This watch doesn't have diamonds, Mr. Reed," David continued softly. "It doesn't scream for attention, but it measured 30 years of honest sweat. It measured a man coming home every single night with clean hands and a clear conscience." David paused, letting the silence settle over the crowd. "Cheap men use expensive things to hide who they are," David said, his eyes piercing straight through Julian. "Real men don't need gold to prove their worth." Money isn't loud, Mr. Reed. Wealth speaks in a whisper. Only insecurity has to shout. A sharp clap echoed from a nearby table. Then another. Within seconds, a wave of applause rippled through the surrounding executives, business owners, and city leaders. Several older gentlemen raised their whiskey glasses in toast toward David and Sarah. Julian's face turned bright red. He snapped his wrist back into his jacket sleeve, turning away in utter humiliation. Jessica shrank back behind Mark, her crimson dress no longer feeling like a symbol of triumph, but a loud, desperate cry for attention. Mark stood, utterly paralyzed. He stared at Sarah. For 12 years, he had believed she was nothing without him. He had called her a ghost. He had left her in a dark kitchen with $5,000, believing she would spend the rest of her life suffocating under the weight of her own insignificance. Now, he stood in the shadows of her success. She had built an empire without him. She was surrounded by respect, genuine love, and unshakable power. Sarah turned her head, slightly, and looked at Mark. Her eyes were deep, clear, and quiet. There was no hatred in them. There was no joy in his humiliation. There was only the absolute, chilling absence of any feeling at all. She sat down at the central VIP table beside David, unfolding her napkin as the waiter poured sparkling water into her glass. She did not need the applause. She did not need Mark's regret. Her worth had been forged in the quiet darkness of a rain-soaked kitchen 5 years ago. And tonight, under 1,000 shining lights, Sarah Miller was entirely, beautifully whole. The applause inside the grand ballroom had barely faded when the brass double doors swung open once more. A heavy silence washed over the room, instantly choking the hum of jazz piano and clinking champagne glasses. 4 men in dark charcoal suits stepped briskly past the hotel reception desk. Their movements were swift, disciplined, and relentless. 2 uniformed officers from the Atlanta Police Department followed closely behind them. Leading the team was Special Agent Marcus Miller of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, his gold badge gleaming under the warm chandelier light. The air in the ballroom grew instantly cold, smelling of rain, damp trench coats, and sharp authority. Mark Thorne froze, his hand trembling as he set down his glass. Beside him, Jessica Vance clutched Julian's arm, her diamond-draped wrist shaking. "Julian," Jessica whispered, her voice cracking with sudden panic. "What is going on?" Julian Reed didn't answer. His face had turned the gray color of wet ash. He backed away from the VIP table, looking frantically toward the service exits near the kitchen. Julian Reed, also known as Julian Vance, Julian Montgomery, and Marcus Reed. Special Agent Miller's voice echoed across the high ceilings, sharp as a rifle shot. "Stand down and keep your hands visible." Before Julian could step toward the side door, 2 federal agents flanked him, pinning his arms behind his back with practiced efficiency. The metallic snap of steel handcuffs echoed loudly against the marble floor. Click-clack. "What are you doing?" Julian shouted, his arrogant composure crumbling into high-pitched hysteria. "Do you know who I am? I am a senior managing partner at Reed Private Equity. Call my attorneys." Special Agent Miller pulled a folded federal warrant from his jacket pocket, stepping into the center of the light. "Julian Reed, you are under arrest pursuant to a federal warrant issued by the Northern District of Georgia," Special Agent Miller read aloud, his voice calm and unyielding. "You are charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, securities fraud, and identity theft." A collective gasp echoed across the room. News cameras flashed, capturing every second of the spectacle. "For 18 months, you have been the subject of a multi-state federal Interpol red notice," Agent Miller continued, looking straight at Julian. "You targeted divorced women, widows, and ambitious real estate developers across 3 states, extracting millions in fake infrastructure investments before disappearing. Julian thrashed against the agent's grip, but they held him pinned. Jessica stepped forward, her crimson dress rustling violently. Her eyes were wide with terror. "No, that's impossible. He's an investor. He's managing my $500,000 divorce settlement. We are buying a Buckhead estate next month." Agent Miller looked at Jessica with grim pity. "Ma'am, Mr. Reed has no private equity firm. The entity you wired your money to is a shell bank account in the Cayman Islands that was drained 48 hours ago," Agent Miller explained coldly. "Furthermore, Mr. Reed is currently legally married to a woman in Savannah who filed a missing persons report 6 months ago after he stole her retirement savings." The room spun violently around Jessica. "No, no, no, no!" Jessica screamed, her voice tearing through the ballroom. She sank to her knees on the hard parquet floor, clutching her head. Her gold-painted makeup smeared down her face in dark streaks of mascara and tears. "My money, my settlement. He promised me everything." She looked at Julian, her hands clawing at the air. "You lied to me. You took everything I had." Julian didn't look at her. He didn't offer a single word of regret. His eyes were cold, hollow, and vacant, the eyes of a predator who had simply been caught. What Jessica didn't know was how the FBI had finally tracked Julian to the Regency Hotel that night. 2 days prior, Sarah Miller had flagged Julian's name through her corporate banking oversight network after a fellow female entrepreneur mentioned his investment proposals. Recognizing the pattern of financial exploitation, Sarah had quietly submitted corroborating business records to federal authorities. The Regency Gala was not a coincidence. It was the trap Julian walked into. The federal agents hauled Julian toward the main exit. His heavy gold Rolex caught the light one last time before he was pushed into the night. Mark Thorne stood paralyzed beside the table. He looked down at Jessica weeping helplessly on the floor, then looked up at Sarah. The illusion had completely shattered. The glamour, the status, the Buckhead estate, all of it had been built on a foundation of quicksand and lies. Mark felt a sudden, suffocating wave of shame. 5 years ago, he had discarded Sarah like trash, believing Jessica was his ticket to the elite circles of Atlanta. Now, Jessica was ruined, Julian was headed to federal prison, and Mark's own reputation in the real estate sector was completely annihilated. He looked across the central VIP table. Sarah stood beside David Vance. She looked breathtaking. Her emerald dress glowed under the warm lights. She was a self-made multimillionaire, respected by every leader in the city, loved by a man of real integrity, and completely free. Mark took a hesitating, desperate step toward Sarah. His voice was trembling, hollowed out by regret. "Sarah," Mark stammered, extending a shaking hand. "Sarah, please, I didn't know. He fooled us all. I was just trying to protect our family's future. You have to believe me." He stepped closer, his eyes wet with desperate tears. "Sarah, look at what we used to have. 12 years. We built so much together. Can we just talk? Please, help me clean this up. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake." Sarah did not step back. She did not hide behind David. She stood tall, looking at Mark with quiet, absolute clarity. "Mark," Sarah said. Her voice was steady, calm, and free of any tremor. Mark stopped in his tracks, searching her eyes for a spark of memory, a hint of the woman who used to stay up until 3 in the morning sewing his suits. "For 8 years, I answered your phone calls for one reason only." "Chloe," Sarah said softly, her words carrying the weight of unbreakable truth. "I never hated you, Mark, and I don't hate you tonight. But our boundary stops right here." Mark swallowed hard, his lips quivering. "Sarah, please." "You didn't ruin my life 5 years ago, Mark," Sarah continued, her eyes fixed on his. "And you didn't ruin your own life tonight because of Julian. You ruined your life the moment you decided that appearances mattered more than character. You chose to live a lie, and a lie always collects its debt." She took David's hand, her fingers intertwined with his, solid and warm. "I don't owe you my pity, Mark," Sarah said softly. "And I certainly don't owe you my past." Mark opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He stood utterly defeated, stripped of his pride, his status, and his dignity. Two police officers escorted Jessica out of the ballroom as her quiet sobs echoed down the hallway. Guests slowly returned to their tables, speaking in hushed, solemn tones about the spectacle they had just witnessed. Sarah turned to David. David looked down at her, his blue eyes filled with profound love and quiet pride. He squeezed her hand gently. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Vance?" David asked softly. "Yes," Sarah smiled, her eyes bright and clear. "Let's go home." Together, Sarah and David walked toward the grand brass doors. They walked past the hushed crowds, past the scattered silver place cards, and past Mark Thorne standing frozen in the shadows of the room. Sarah did not look back. Not once. She stepped out into the cool Atlanta night air, leaving the storm behind her forever. Late October arrived in northern Georgia with a soft, amber sky. The sun sank low over the rolling hills outside Atlanta, painting the oak trees in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. A cool autumn breeze swept across the wooden porch of Sarah and David's ranch house, carrying the sweet scent of burning pine. Sarah stood near the porch railing, wearing a cozy knit cardigan. She held a steaming ceramic mug, watching the golden hour light dance across the lawn. Beside her, David leaned against a wooden pillar, his steel watch catching the warm rays of the setting sun. Gravel crunched along the driveway. Chloe sprinted up the porch steps, her cheeks flushed red from the cool air. Her blue eyes sparkled with joy as she waved a heavy white envelope. "Mom, David, look," Chloe gasped, catching her breath. "I got it. The Evelyn Scholarship for Structural Engineering." Sarah set her mug down, pulling her daughter into a tight embrace. Chloe held up the official acceptance letter, her voice trembling with excitement. "I looked up the foundation online," Chloe said softly. "It says the fund was created by someone named Evelyn Miller." "Mom, that was Grandma's name." Chloe looked at Sarah, her eyes wide with sudden realization. "Did you set up this fund?" Sarah smiled warmly, placing her hands on Chloe's shoulders. "I established the fund years ago, Chloe," Sarah said gently. "But the selection board is completely independent. They didn't know your name or your story. You didn't win this because of me. Your essay on sustainable urban bridges won this on its own merit. We built the road, Chloe, but your own feet walked it." Chloe's eyes welled with proud tears. She hugged her mother tightly, feeling the unshakable strength of a woman who had taught her how to stand alone. As Chloe went inside to call her friends, she settled over the porch once more. The sky shifted into glowing orange hues. Sarah looked out over the quiet land, reflecting on her journey. 5 years ago, she was a ghost in a dark kitchen, suffocating under a broken marriage. Today, she stood as a self-made woman, an entrepreneur, a mother, and a wife to a man of real integrity. She had stopped playing the victim long ago. She no longer blamed Mark or carried the burden of past betrayals. She had taken complete responsibility for her happiness. The pain had not broken her. It had simply burned away what was fragile, leaving behind resilient steel. David stepped close, slipping his hand into hers. His palm was warm, rough, and reassuring. He handed her a fresh cup of coffee. "Cold coffee is just a reminder to slow down," David said softly. Sarah laughed, a light, genuine sound that echoed into the autumn air. She took a slow sip, letting the warmth spread through her chest. She leaned her head against David's shoulder, watching the autumn leaves drift softly to the ground. There was no bitterness left in her heart, only peace. True healing did not arrive with loud revenge. It arrived quietly, built one ordinary morning at a time. Sarah had stitched her own way out of the dark, and now she stood in the golden light, free, proud, and entirely whole. All shadows must fade before the truth, and every pain is simply the start of a beautiful rebirth. Always remember, the right to write a new chapter of your life is forever in your hands. If this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment below so we know we're walking this journey together. Hope to see you on the next page.